You rewrote what? The CEO growled, flipping through the contract. Who touched this? Silence fell. Because the answer wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't even an employee on record. It was Thomas Greene, the aging janitor who'd been invisible for years, until one night he scribbled 4 red lines on a billion-dollar contract and rewrote the future. What follows is a breathtaking journey of humility, genius, and poetic justice. From basement floors to boardroom power, Thomas challenges everything the corporate world believes about status, voice, and value. As policies shift and hearts open, one quiet man becomes the architect of a revolution. Now, before we dive deeper, please subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know where you're watching from. Thank you so much. And now, let's get back to the story. I said fix it, not feed me excuses. The billionaire's voice cracked like a whip through the glass walls of the 32nd floor boardroom. Chairs shifted uneasily. A dozen suits sat rigid around a gleaming walnut table as their CEO, Gregory Langston, the sharpest dealmaker on Wall Street, thrust a thick packet of legal papers onto the polished surface. The echo bounced off the high-rise windows that overlooked Manhattan's gleaming skyline, but no one dared respond. It was nearly midnight. Every legal mind in the building had been pulled into the room hours ago. The deadline for finalizing the Carlton Tech merger, a $1.2 billion acquisition poised to shake up the global tech industry, was less than 24 hours away. But a single clause buried deep on page 62 had become the anchor, threatening to sink the entire ship. The clause, a tangled string of legalese regarding overseas tax liabilities, was designed to protect Carlton Tech's shell entities. But it was impenetrable and worse, potentially illegal. If not resolved, the deal would collapse, and Langston never lost. Stanford law, Yale law, Harvard law, but not one of you can untangle a basic clause? Langston spat, his voice laced with disdain. Silence. A younger executive nervously adjusted his tie. Sir, we've been through every angle. If we remove the clause, Carlton walks. If we keep it, the DOJ may intervene. Langston's gaze turned icy. Then make it legal. Outside, mopping near the corridor's end, Thomas Greene paused. He shouldn't have heard that. But the boardroom's walls weren't as soundproof as people like to believe, and at this hour, with the echo of heels long gone and only the low hum of elevators in motion, even whispers had weight. He leaned his mop against the wall and glanced toward the room. He could see their silhouettes, flustered, angry, desperate. He recognized that tone, that energy. The storm of men in suits chasing power like it was air. He used to breathe that same air once. The voice that boomed from the room struck a familiar nerve. Unless one of you morphs into a miracle, this company loses tomorrow. Thomas's grip tightened on the mop handle. His eyes, the soft gray of worn-out wisdom, drifted to the glass doors. He looked down at his shoes, old but clean. His janitor's uniform was neatly pressed. His cart was in order, cleaning supplies arranged by color and scent. Everything about him said, invisible, insignificant, and silent. But inside him, something stirred. Not arrogance, not defiance, just recognition. That clause. He didn't just understand it. He knew it. It was almost laughable. He'd studied contracts like that in night school a decade ago, in borrowed books, in online forums, in silent libraries while the world slept and his wife fought for her life in a hospital bed. While she fought, he studied. While others forgot him, he remembered everything. He moved closer. Just enough to glimpse the final page left open on the CEO's desk. Just enough to see the offending clause, highlighted in red. The rest of the team had begun to gather their things. One man muttered, "We'll try again in the morning." "No," Langston barked. "You'll try again now." But Thomas had already memorized it. The wording, the structure, the flaw. It wasn't illegal. It was inverted. The clause was grammatically correct, but logically reversed. It applied accountability to the buyer instead of the seller. With one inversion, it shifted the weight of legal consequence. But no one saw it because they assumed Carlton Tech's lawyers were competent. They were, but they were also cunning. Thomas blinked slowly. His breath settled. He whispered, barely audible even to himself, "They're reading it backward." He waited until the last tide disappeared into the elevator. The boardroom now empty except for discarded papers and half-drunk coffee cups. The janitor nobody looked twice at quietly entered. He didn't sit. He didn't even step beyond the edge of the room. Instead, he approached the contract like a priest approaching scripture. His fingertips traced the margin gently. Then, from his breast pocket, he took out a black pen, one he used for his nightly crossword puzzles. It clicked with finality. In 4 swift lines, he rewrote the clause. No fanfare, no performance, just surgical precision. Then he placed the packet neatly atop the CEO's chair and walked away without a sound. Back in the hallway, he picked up his mop again. The silence returned. The world clicked back into place. The stars outside blinked behind clouds. By morning, his fingerprints would be wiped away. By morning, someone else would be credited. And that, Thomas thought, was fine, because he didn't do it for recognition. He did it because something inside him refused to stay silent when he knew he was right. Because some things weren't about mops or mergers. They were about memory. And this clause, it was the kind of thing you didn't forget. He continued down the corridor, pushing his cart gently past glowing exit signs, his steps slow, his back tired. But in his mind, a quiet certainty echoed louder than the silence around him. They'll see. They always do, eventually. The next morning broke over Manhattan like a silent promise. Golden light stretching between towers, washing over windows, and tracing the tired faces of those already marching into steel offices with caffeine and anxiety in their veins. Inside Langston Global, the boardroom was as it had been left, except for one detail. The contract now rested perfectly centered on Gregory Langston's chair, the red-inked clause scribbled over in confident, clean handwriting. It was a junior assistant who spotted it first. Her name was Marissa Cheng, 26, whip-smart, unnoticed. She'd come in early as usual because she couldn't afford not to. Working 2 jobs and clawing toward law school, she saw the contract and tilted her head, eyes narrowing. She recognized the clause. She remembered it because she'd spent all night trying to decipher it, desperate to impress someone, anyone. But what she read now was different. Not just revised, transformed. The change was small, barely 4 lines, but it shifted the burden of liability with surgical clarity. The buyer no longer held the legal noose. The seller now owned the weight. The merger could move forward. Her breath caught. She grabbed the document, heart racing, and ran it down the hall to the legal department. "Where did you get this?" one of the senior counsels demanded as he flipped through the pages, his eyes widening. "It was left in the boardroom." "Who touched this contract?" he asked again, more to the air than to her. "It wasn't like this last night," another lawyer added. "I remember. We all saw the original version." The legal director, a stern woman named Angela Rollins, looked up sharply. "Bring it to Mr. Langston, now." The contract traveled like a sacred scroll, through trembling hands and astonished gasps until it reached Gregory Langston's desk. He was alone, nursing a black coffee and staring out the window, already preparing for war. The legal team entered as a unit, silent and tense. Rollins held the packet like it was burning her fingers. "We found something," she said carefully. He turned slowly. "Is it fixed?" She nodded once. "And? We don't know who did it." He stared at her. She passed the contract forward and he flipped to page 62. He read it once, then twice, then a third time, slower. A silence fell so heavy it felt like time itself was holding its breath. When he finally looked up, his voice was low. "Who touched this?" "We're not sure. Marissa found it this morning. It was left on your chair." Langston stood, the chair groaning as he pushed it back. "Get security to pull the footage. Find out who was in that room. I want a name, and I want it now." In the basement, where the security office buzzed with monitors and stale coffee, 3 guards huddled over replay footage from the previous night. Camera 14, angled at the boardroom door, showed what they didn't expect. A janitor. Alone. Entering quietly at 12:53 a.m., standing at the head of the table, flipping a few pages, then leaning in. Writing. Just for a moment. Then leaving, mop in hand, as if nothing had happened. One guard sat back in his chair, stunned. "You ever seen that guy before?" The supervisor squinted. "Yeah, that's Thomas. Been here for years." Upstairs, the video was played again for the board. Langston watched in silence, arms folded across his chest. The room was packed. Legal, operations, PR, finance, all standing like statues as the janitor's image flickered on screen. "Thomas Greene," someone confirmed. "He's worked night shifts for over a decade, never caused any trouble." Langston's eyes narrowed. "Bring him to me." Word spread like a shockwave. By the time Thomas was found, quietly emptying trash bins in the sub-level archive. Everyone knew, but no one said it out loud. They just stared as he was escorted upstairs. He didn't resist, didn't speak. Just walked calmly behind the guards as elevators dinged open and whispers followed him like shadows. The boardroom was full again. Except now, the focus of every sharp suit and sharpened gaze was a man in a gray janitor uniform, his name stitched above his heart, his hands still smelling faintly of disinfectant. Gregory Langston didn't stand. He simply looked at Thomas and asked one question. "You rewrote this clause?" Thomas looked down, then up. "Yes, sir." "You understand what this is?" "I believe so." Langston's voice grew colder. "Where did you learn to write legal language like this?" Thomas's answer came not with pride, but with quiet weariness. "Night classes. Years ago, I never got the degree. My wife got sick. I had to work, but I kept reading." There was no defense in his voice, no apology either, just facts, delivered without fear. Angela Rollins stepped forward, her arms crossed. "Mr. Greene, this correction is not just clever, it's brilliant. You exposed a multi-million-dollar trap laid by one of the top firms in the country." "I just read it differently," he said simply. The room didn't know what to do with that. A janitor? Outsmarting lawyers? Langston stared at him, expression unreadable. "Why didn't you say anything before?" "No one ever asked," Thomas replied, and there was no bitterness, just truth. Langston stood, slowly. He walked around the table. Stopped directly in front of Thomas. "This company was about to bleed out on a contract we couldn't see straight, and you, a man who mops our floors at midnight, saw it in minutes." He let the silence hang. Thomas shifted slightly. "Would you have listened if I had spoken?" The room froze. Langston blinked. Then, something almost imperceptible passed over his face. Not a smile, but maybe a beginning of one. "No," he admitted, then louder to the whole room, "but I'm listening now." Thomas stood there, still, composed, tired. But in his silence, there was power. And the people in the boardroom, those used to power, used to deals, used to control, they felt something different. They felt respect. This wasn't just about a clause, it was about how brilliance doesn't always wear a tie. And some of the sharpest minds in the world might walk right past you every day, holding a mop. Thomas Greene stood alone in the middle of a boardroom built for titans, surrounded by mahogany, steel, and the hollow echoes of stunned silence. Every eye on him, every heartbeat in the room, synchronized not in rhythm, but in disbelief. He didn't flinch. He didn't shrink. He simply adjusted the faded sleeve of his uniform and met their gaze without apology. Not with defiance, but with the quiet certainty of a man who no longer needed to prove anything. Langston remained standing before him, his eyes unreadable, flickering with 1,000 calculations. Behind him, lawyers still clutched the revised contract like it was gospel newly discovered, uncertain whether they were witnesses to brilliance or to something more disruptive, something dangerous. Gregory Langston was not a man who often felt humbled. But now, in the presence of this man, this janitor with calm hands and sharper intellect than a dozen board-certified attorneys, he felt something he rarely allowed himself to feel, small. And that made him curious. "You still remember contract law after all these years?" he asked, his tone softer than before. Thomas gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I never stopped reading. I still go to the law library sometimes. University lets the public in if you're quiet." "You've been cleaning floors for 18 years, Langston said. "Why?" Thomas exhaled through his nose, a slow breath, heavy with memory. "My wife, Clara," he said gently. "She was diagnosed with ALS, fast-moving. We didn't have much. No insurance. The only job I could find that let me be nearby was this one." No one moved. He continued, the words slow but unflinching. "She passed after 3 years. I stayed because I had nothing else. But the reading helped, the logic of the law. It kept me sane." Langston sat down then, not out of dominance but reverence. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said. "Thank you." Angela Rollins, still standing near the far end of the table, finally broke her silence. "Sir, this man just saved the firm millions. That correction, it's airtight. Elegant. I'd like to know what we plan to do next." Langston looked at Thomas. And for the first time since taking over the company from his father 15 years ago, his next move wasn't already scripted in his mind. He stood again, slowly this time. "Mr. Greene," he said, "would you be willing to walk me through exactly what you saw in that clause? In your own words. Thomas nodded and stepped forward. He didn't take a seat, didn't ask for one. He walked toward the screen on the far end of the room, where the clause had been projected in red earlier. With the pen still in his shirt pocket, he pointed to the section in question. The original clause placed liability on the buyer for any discovered overseas holdings. Now, that in itself is not illegal, unless the seller deliberately hid assets. In that case, it shifts the burden onto someone unaware. That's what made it dangerous. And you saw that? Yes, but more than that. Thomas paused, then rewrote a sentence on the touchscreen, his handwriting clear, deliberate, unshaking. It's written like a misdirection. Carlton Tech wanted us to think it was standard liability, but this section here, he underlined a phrase, this clause turns our due diligence into a liability trap. He stepped back. You restructured it to protect us from future litigation? Rollins asked, her voice carrying a new tone, respect. I clarified accountability, that's all, Thomas said. Langston stared at the screen. Then he did something no one in that room expected. He turned to his executive assistant. Cancel the rest of my morning, clear my lunch, call marketing, tell them not to release the merger PR just yet. Then to Thomas, you're coming with me. The room buzzed, executives exchanged glances, no one spoke. Minutes later, Thomas walked beside Langston through the executive wing, a space he had cleaned countless times, now walking it not as a ghost in the shadows, but as a man beside the king. They entered Langston's private conference room, smaller, quieter, but more personal. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the East River. The city was awake now, and so was something else. Langston gestured to a chair. Thomas sat. The CEO leaned forward. I've spent my life surrounded by people who pretend to be smart. Ivy League, polished shoes, expensive words. But you walked in, rewrote 4 lines, and saved a deal that's taken 6 months and 2 law firms to assemble. Thomas folded his hands in his lap. It was never about being smart, just about seeing what others didn't. Langston nodded slowly. I want to offer you a position. Not charity, not tokenism. I want you advising my legal strategy team. Thomas's brows rose. Langston continued. Contract review, strategic oversight. You won't be cleaning floors anymore. I'll have HR draft the terms by the end of the day. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. His eyes drifted to the skyline, then back to Langston. I appreciate the offer, he said, but I'm not sure I belong in that world anymore. Langston leaned forward. Mr. Greene, no one belongs more than you. What you did, how you did it, shows judgment I haven't seen in this office in years. That's what I need. Silence hung in the air. Then Thomas asked the one question that mattered most to him. Will I be heard? Not humored, not paraded. Heard? Langston stared at him, then extended his hand. You have my word. Thomas looked at that hand for a moment, weathered, powerful, used to commanding rooms. Then he shook it. A firm grip. No fear, no hesitation. It was the beginning of something neither of them fully understood yet. In that moment, the story of a man who had once mopped around boardrooms turned, quietly, irrevocably, into the story of the man reshaping them from the inside. They gave him a badge. Plastic. Laminated. His photo grainy under the office lights. It clipped awkwardly to the same janitor uniform he had worn just the night before. Only now it carried a new designation beneath his name. Legal strategy consultant. It didn't feel real. Thomas Greene stood in front of the HR glass, holding the badge like it was evidence in a trial he hadn't meant to win. A woman with coral lipstick and a fast-talking voice had handed it to him while explaining benefits, dental, stock options, things he hadn't had in decades. People passed by in silence. Some looked twice, some whispered, others just stared. And it wasn't the stares that unsettled him. It was the pause, that breath people took now when they saw him. That moment when they remembered, this is the man who rewrote the contract. He was no longer invisible, and he wasn't sure that was a good thing. When the elevator doors opened on the 35th floor, Langston's executive division, Thomas felt the weight in his chest grow heavier, not from fear, but from something deeper. A lifetime of being overlooked had made him fluent in silence. Now every footstep sounded like it mattered. The office they gave him had glass walls, not large, not ostentatious, but real, with a desk, a nameplate, a computer, even a plant in the corner he didn't recognize but appreciated for trying. Still, as he sat down, he felt like an imposter. He had no degree, no suit, just a mind filled with forgotten laws and a soul made cautious by grief. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Marissa Cheng stepped inside, carrying a folder and a hesitant smile. "Hi, I hope I'm not interrupting," she said. I was the one who found your notes." Thomas stood. "Ah, so you're the reason I'm not sweeping the lobby right now." She laughed nervously. "I guess we both read things no one else did." He smiled. It was the first smile he'd let linger since all of this began. She held out the folder. "Mr. Langston wants your eyes on the acquisition draft for Renshaw Dynamics. There's a clause in there about non-compete terms post-merger. He wants to make sure it's bulletproof." Thomas accepted the folder but didn't open it right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked. "You studied law?" She nodded. "Applying next cycle? Working here to save up. I wasn't supposed to touch that contract, but I wanted to see if I could understand it." "You did more than understand it," he said. "You respected it. That's rare." She hesitated, then asked softly, "Can I learn from you?" That question struck deeper than she could have known. Because it had been years since anyone thought his mind was worth listening to, let alone learning from. He nodded. "Of course." She left with a thank you and a spark in her eyes that reminded him of himself long ago. Before the hospitals, before the mop, before hope was rationed out in silent sips. Thomas opened the folder. 15 minutes later he saw it. Buried 3 paragraphs deep in legal jargon was a phrase designed to look harmless. Reasonable regional limitations post-employment. But in this case, reasonable was defined in an appendix as a 700-mile restriction zone. That meant any former executive would be barred from working in their field across nearly half the country. It wouldn't hold up in court, but it would burn goodwill. Thomas rewrote the clause, not to win, but to preserve. To create clarity instead of domination. He printed the revision and placed it gently on Langston's desk, who hadn't yet arrived. Then returned to his office and closed the door. Not fully, just enough to leave the world outside at a whisper. Moments later, his phone rang. "Mr. Greene," Langston's voice said, firm as always, "walk me through the change you made." 10 minutes later, they stood again in front of the whiteboard, this time side by side. Thomas explained. Langston listened. When Thomas finished, the CEO nodded once. "You think like a judge. I just think like someone who doesn't want to fight battles that leave everyone bloody." Langston tapped the paper. "This is rare. You rewrote a trap into a bridge." "That's all contracts should be," Thomas said. "Bridges." Langston stared at him a long while, then spoke quietly. "My father built this company by outmaneuvering everyone. Deals, lawsuits, power plays. It made us rich, but it made us enemies." He looked up. "I want to do it differently." Thomas folded his arms. "Then start with truth. Not just in words, but in how you see people." Langston blinked, as if the words struck harder than he expected. And that was the moment the boardroom began to shift. Not in chairs or walls or glass, but in spirit. That afternoon, Langston called a surprise executive session. The full board arrived, curious, skeptical. Many expected another fire to be extinguished. But Langston stood at the front, beside Thomas, and said 3 words that hadn't been heard in that room since the company's founding. "I was wrong." The silence was immediate. "I've relied on titles, on resumes, on prestige, and I nearly let it cost us the Carlton deal. But the man beside me, Thomas Greene, saw what none of us did. And he's going to lead our internal strategy reviews from now on." A murmur swept the room. Langston continued. "Not just because he's smart, but because he sees people. He sees truth, and frankly, we need more of both." Thomas didn't speak. He didn't need to. The stunned silence of men and women who had once stepped over his mop bucket said more than any applause ever could. They weren't just shocked, they were changed. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Thomas stepped out onto the 26th floor, legal strategy now etched in brass beside the frosted glass wall. He wasn't used to this floor. The ceilings were lower here, the lights warmer, less steel, more wood, less war room, more library. It suited him. He walked slowly down the corridor, past young attorneys still too afraid to look up, past interns whispering theories about the janitor who rewrote a billion-dollar contract. His badge clipped to his shirt caught the light. His silence caught their attention. When he stepped into his office, something was different. The plant had been moved closer to the sunlight. A note on his desk read, "Keep growing, we're watching. MC Marissa Cheng." The assistant who once walked contracts down silent hallways now shadowed every meeting Thomas joined, not because she was assigned, but because she asked, and because he said yes. She knocked once and stepped in with a manila folder clutched tight to her chest. "They've sent over the first draft of the Russotech acquisition," she said, her voice more confident now, more sure. "And they want you to take the first pass." Thomas took the folder. "Me?" She smiled. "Apparently, Langston said if it doesn't pass your standard, it doesn't go forward." That surprised him. Not because he doubted his ability, but because power, when it shifts, rarely announces itself with such grace. He opened the folder and scanned the first few paragraphs. Language was sharp, deliberate. Russotech's legal team wasn't hiding their ambition. He recognized a few of the signatures. Names he hadn't seen since the days he'd buried himself in free legal databases and bar association records while Clara lay sleeping across the room. Some of those names had become legends. Now their arguments sat before him. He marked 3 sections, underlined 2, and rewrote 1 paragraph entirely. An hour passed, then 2. He was no longer simply reviewing contracts, he was shaping them. At 3:30 p.m., he stepped into the small conference room Langston had begun calling the table. It wasn't the boardroom, it wasn't surrounded by suits and egos, it was quieter, sleeker, it was for thinkers. Langston was already seated, flipping through a printed draft of the acquisition terms. "You saw the predatory equity clause?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "They're using a step-up valuation to bleed controls slowly. 3 phases. By the time we realize it, they'll have veto power." Langston sighed. "That's what I thought." "I removed it, replaced it with a revenue floor instead of a control shift." Langston looked up. "You rewrote their leverage?" "I offered something more honest." Langston leaned back, smiling faintly. "They're going to hate us." Thomas returned the smile. "Then they'll know we're being fair." Langston shook his head in disbelief. "I've had consultants with 7-figure retainers who never caught this kind of detail." "That's because most people read to win," Thomas said. "I read to understand." The words hung between them. It wasn't long before word of Thomas's insight spread beyond the walls of Langston Global. Industry blogs speculated on the mystery mind behind the deal turnaround. Former rivals sent messages. Other CEOs asked quiet questions. Whispers became calls. Calls became meetings. But Thomas remained grounded. He refused television interviews, he declined panel invites, he even turned down a profile feature in the Wall Street Journal. When asked why, he simply said, "The story isn't mine alone. It belongs to every person who ever felt invisible. I'm not here to be famous, I'm here to build." And build he did. But the more Thomas rose, the more he found himself drawn to moments of stillness. Late one night, long after the last light in the strategy office had been switched off, he walked down to the basement. The janitorial locker room hadn't changed. The vending machine still flickered when you pressed B4. The old couch still sagged in the middle. He sat down slowly. Let the silence settle. The smell of bleach. The creak of air vents. The distant hum of cleaning machines still running on auto. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a photograph. Faded, soft at the edges. Clara in the sun, laughing. A book open in her lap, her fingers tucked under her chin. He let out a long breath. "I hope you see this," he whispered. "I hope you know it wasn't all for nothing." The next morning, Marissa found him already in his office, tie crooked, eyes distant but sharp. She placed a new folder in front of him. "What's this?" he asked. She hesitated. "Langston wants you to look at internal policy contracts next. Employment terms, raises, maternity leave clauses. He says if we're going to be a company that sees people, we start here." Thomas nodded slowly. He picked up the pen. That afternoon, a new clause was drafted. It granted paid maternity leave not just for full-time executives, but for janitors, for cafeteria workers, for mailroom staff, for every soul that walked those halls unseen for too long. Thomas didn't sign it with fanfare. He just placed the draft on Langston's desk and walked away. Because real change doesn't scream. It doesn't need to. It simply writes itself quietly until everyone can read it. The boardroom was different now. Not in architecture. The long walnut table still stretched beneath the chandelier like a spine of polished power. The city still shimmered through floor-to-ceiling windows. But the atmosphere, that was what had changed. It was no longer a place where only titles spoke. Now, truth echoed. Gregory Langston sat at the head, flipping through a revised employee policy handbook. His jaw flexed slightly as he read the clauses: parental leave for all staff, mental health support for overnight teams, sabbaticals for non-executive workers after 10 years of service. He turned the page. A clause about contract literacy training, optional sessions hosted by Thomas Greene himself, once a month, open to any employee, janitor to executive. Langston didn't smile, but something shifted in his posture. "About time," he muttered. Across from him, Angela Rollins was already nodding. "It's strong, fair, legally airtight, but more than that, it's human." Thomas sat to her right. He hadn't spoken yet, just listened, watched, studied the eyes of the people who once never saw him at all. He was still getting used to this seat. He didn't need it, but he respected what it meant now. A space once reserved only for the loudest voices was making room for the quietest wisdom. Langston closed the handbook and placed it in the center of the table like a sealed verdict. "Let's put this to vote." No hesitation. Unanimous. The policy passed. But the moment that followed wasn't applause, it was silence. A reverent kind, like the hush of snow before sunrise. The board members lingered, eyes resting on Thomas. Some nodded, some simply sat, letting the quiet be their thank you. Later that evening, Thomas found himself walking the long corridor past the service elevator, the same one he had ridden up and down for over a decade. The lights above it still flickered. The paint on the baseboard still chipped. He stopped. A familiar face emerged from the other side, gray hair, gloves in hand, wheeling a mop bucket. "Thomas?" The man blinked. "They said you were upstairs now? Thought they were joking." "Hey, Reuben," Thomas said softly, smiling. "They weren't." Reuben chuckled. "I'll be damned. They finally saw what I've been saying for years." Thomas leaned against the wall beside him. "You were the only one who ever said it out loud." Reuben's smile faded, replaced with something softer. "We lost too many nights down here wondering if anyone upstairs even knew our names. Guess you showed them." Thomas didn't respond right away. He looked down at the mop, then up at the man. "I'm still one of us," he said. "That doesn't change." Reuben gave a slow, proud nod. "Good, then maybe now they'll start changing." The next day, Langston called a full company meeting. Employees filed into the atrium, administration, logistics, operations, legal, custodial, shoulder to shoulder beneath glass skylights. No one knew what to expect. Langston stepped onto the stage, but this time, he didn't start with numbers or projections. He started with a story. "Years ago, I made the mistake of thinking value came with titles. That intelligence was dressed in suits, that innovation came with credentials." He paused. "I was wrong." He gestured behind him, and Thomas walked forward. The crowd didn't erupt. They didn't gasp. They rose, one by one, quietly, as if standing for something sacred. Thomas stood in front of them, unsure what to say. These weren't board members or clients. These were people who mopped floors, processed invoices, cooked meals, entered back exits, and whose lives had taught them to expect invisibility. He looked at them, really looked, and spoke. "Most of you don't know me, and most of you probably never saw me. That's okay. I spent a lot of years not seeing myself." A pause. "I took this job to survive. I stayed because I couldn't afford to leave. But what I carried with me every night wasn't just a mop. It was a memory of what I once dreamed I could become." His voice caught slightly, then steadied. "I never imagined that dream would walk back into the room because I fixed a few lines of a contract. But maybe that's the point." He looked at the sea of faces. "Maybe your chance doesn't arrive loud. Maybe it comes in a whisper, in a moment nobody notices, in a job nobody respects. But if you keep showing up with your full self, one day, someone will see you." Silence. Breathless, wide-eyed, then thunder. Applause. Standing, clapping, weeping applause. Langston placed a hand on Thomas's shoulder. In that moment, the entire company wasn't just witnessing a transformation. They were participating in one. Because Thomas hadn't just corrected a contract, he had rewritten the definition of worth. Later, as people returned to their floors, eyes wet, minds turning, Langston called Angela Rollins into his office. "I want him at every strategy summit," he said. She nodded. "He'll need a title, something official." Langston stared out the window, then smiled faintly. "Give him one they'll never forget." The title came 2 days later, printed on thick ivory cardstock embossed in silver, delivered not by email but by hand. Thomas Greene, strategic counsel to the CEO. There was no job description attached, just a single line scribbled at the bottom in Langston's handwriting, to see what others miss. Thomas held the card for a long time before slipping it into the inside pocket of his blazer. He still wasn't used to wearing one. The fabric itched at his wrists. The collar sat too stiff, but Marissa had insisted it was the right moment, and she'd helped him pick it out, smiling as she adjusted the shoulders in the store mirror. "You wear respect well," she'd said. He hadn't known how to reply. Now he walked the halls of Langston Global, not with hesitation, but with gravity. Not faster, not louder, just deeper. People greeted him now, some with pride, some with guilt, but none with mockery. That chapter had closed the moment the company rewrote its own laws, with his hands holding the pen. The new employee handbook rolled out that morning. Thomas had personally reviewed the final print, not for typos, not for legal cracks, but for honor. He'd made sure that the cafeteria team now had guaranteed annual reviews, that part-time staff could access mentorship programs, that custodial workers had a path towards supervisory training if they desired it, and funding to pursue higher education if they dared. He knew most of them wouldn't ask for it, which is why he built it to find them anyway. At noon, Thomas sat in a small glass room tucked away near the operations floor. A hand-painted sign outside the door read, "Lunch and Learn. Ask me anything. Yes, anything." It was his idea. No cameras, no pressure. Just a table, a whiteboard, and a dozen folding chairs. First come, first served. At 12:04, a shy mailroom clerk entered, followed by 2 maintenance workers, and then a woman from accounting who'd heard rumors and wanted to see if they were true. Thomas greeted each one like they were old friends. When they sat, he didn't open a laptop. He didn't hand out printouts. He just asked, "What do you want to understand?" For the next hour, they talked about contracts, about language, about the fear of sounding stupid, about the rules no one ever explained. Thomas broke them down like puzzles, not barriers. He drew diagrams on the board, told stories, laughed, and when the session ended, he walked them back to their posts, not because he had to, because he remembered. The next day, there were 30 people in the room. By the end of the week, HR had moved the class to the 8th floor auditorium. They still called it Ask Me Anything. And they meant it. That Friday, as Thomas packed his satchel to head home, Marissa knocked gently on his open door. "You've got a visitor," she said. He looked up. "A client?" She shook her head. "No. She asked for you by name." When he reached the lobby, he saw her. Mid-60s, tired eyes, winter coat too thin for March. He recognized her before she spoke. Her name was Margaret, Clara's childhood friend. A woman who had visited the hospital only once, but had brought soup and a book and sat with Clara for hours in silence. She held an envelope in her hands now. "I didn't know if I should come," she said. "You're always welcome," Thomas said softly. She handed him the envelope. "I saw the article. I saw your name. I wanted you to have this. Clara asked me to give it to you, but only if you ever found your way back." He opened it. Inside was a letter, Clara's handwriting. Elegant, slanted, familiar enough to still crack him open. "My love," it began. "I know you won't read this until the world finds you again, but I want you to know I always saw you, even when the world didn't. You were never just a janitor. You were my defender, my scholar, my safe place. Keep reading the fine print. Keep seeing what others miss. And when they finally listen, speak with grace. Not to punish, but to heal. Because that's what you do. You don't rewrite contracts, Thomas. You rewrite people." He folded the letter slowly, pressed it to his chest. Margaret's eyes brimmed. Thomas swallowed hard, then embraced her. The next morning, he returned to the 26th floor before anyone else arrived. The city was still in that golden silence that belonged only to the early few. He stood at the glass and looked down, not at the skyline, but at the street. At the door he used to enter each night for the janitorial shift. That man still lived inside him, not a ghost, but a foundation. He turned back to his desk and opened a new file. Its title, Human First Negotiation Framework. A new project. Not for a merger, not for profit, but for every company that had lost its way. Thomas began to write, not with urgency, with purpose. Because some revolutions begin not with shouting, but with rewriting. The email hit inboxes at exactly 9 a.m. Subject line, Strategic Council Memo, March Reforms. It was brief, just a few paragraphs. But the final line stopped more than a few hearts. This company does not rise because of who sits in corner offices. It rises because of those who lift without being seen. That ends today. From now on, we see everyone. TG. 3 letters, no title, no arrogance. Just TG. For some, it was the first time they'd ever seen an internal memo that didn't sound like it came from a machine. For others, it was the first time they felt the words were meant for them. In the HR department, someone printed it out and pinned it to the bulletin board with a blue pushpin. In the loading dock, a forklift operator passed it around like it was a handwritten letter from a war hero. And in the break room on the 12th floor, a dishwasher named Lyle read it twice before folding it gently into his wallet. Not because he thought he'd need it, but because it felt like armor. Meanwhile, Thomas sat at his desk, coffee untouched, window half open to let in the spring air. Papers fanned across his workspace, but he wasn't looking at them. Not yet. He was watching the city breathe. From this height, New York looked different. Less frantic, less brutal. The chaos softened into something almost rhythmic. A grid of motion, yes, but also of purpose. He could see delivery drivers on bikes weaving between taxis. He could see a woman walking a dog in heels, balancing a coffee in one hand and a laptop in the other. He could see janitors sweeping the steps of a courthouse. He could see himself. All the past versions, stacked like ghosts in layers of glass, mopping floors, holding books, carrying silent dreams in his coat pocket. He wondered what they would think of this version. The one people called Sir. He still wasn't used to it. At 10:17 a.m. his office line rang. Not the internal line, his private one. It had only rung once before, when Langston called after that first boardroom correction. Now it rang again. He picked it up. Thomas Greene. A pause. Then a deep, composed voice said, "Mr. Greene, this is Judge Evelyn Marlowe. I sit on the New York Appellate Court. I believe we have something to discuss." Thomas sat forward. "Yes, Your Honor." "I read your internal memo. It was passed to me through 3 different hands. I'd like you to consider joining a state advisory board we're forming, focused on ethical language and corporate contracts. Your voice would be uniquely valuable." He blinked. The judge continued. "We're calling it the Plain Words Initiative, designed to prevent hidden clauses and predatory terms. The public doesn't stand a chance if we keep writing law to confuse instead of clarify." Thomas nodded slowly, though she couldn't see it. "I'd be honored," he said. And he meant it. That afternoon, Thomas stood in front of a room full of new hires. Fresh faces, nervous hands, eyes wide. They were here for orientation, not to see him. But he had asked for 10 minutes. Just 10. He stepped to the front, adjusted the mic, and cleared his throat. "I know today's supposed to be about insurance policies and parking spaces," he began, voice calm, measured. "But I want to talk to you about something else." A pause. "I want to talk about visibility." The room stilled. "Not the kind that comes with awards or press. I mean the kind you carry with you when nobody's looking. When you sweep a floor no one walks on. When you rewrite a line, no one will know you touched." He looked around. "You may think your job doesn't matter yet, that it's small, that it's a stepping stone to something better. I understand that. I believed that too, until I realized something." He stepped closer to the front row. "Everything I ever wanted to be already existed inside the work I was doing. It just took the right moment to reveal it." Soft nods from the crowd now. Even the skeptical ones leaned in. "Whatever you do here, do it like it matters, because someone will notice, and when they do, let them find you already shining." The room was silent, then a single clap, then a few more, then a wave. Afterward, 2 interns waited for the crowd to thin before approaching him. One of them, a young man named Ezra, held a small leather-bound notebook. "Mr. Greene," he said, voice cracking slightly, "would you sign my contract manual?" Thomas blinked. "Your manual?" Ezra opened it, pages filled with notes, underlined clauses, hand-drawn arrows. "I've been reading your annotations, the ones you shared in the learning sessions. I've never understood law like this before." Thomas took the book, signed his name quietly on the first page. "Ezra," he said, "promise me something." The boy straightened. "Promise me you'll teach someone else one day. Someone nobody sees coming." Ezra nodded. "I promise." Later that week, Langston found Thomas standing at the edge of the new employee lounge, a space they just renovated based on his recommendations. "You're quiet today," Langston said. Thomas didn't turn. Just thinking. About? Thomas hesitated. About how loud change can be when it starts with a whisper. Langston smiled. You've changed us more than you know. Thomas shook his head. No, you chose to listen. That's the real change. Langston reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small velvet box. I was saving this for the next board meeting, but I'd rather you have it now. He opened it. Inside a pin. Silver. Minimal. Engraved with a single word, counsel. Langston clipped it to Thomas's lapel himself. And for the first time since this journey began, not the night he rewrote the contract, not when the board stood, not even when he read Clara's letter, Thomas felt something bloom behind his ribs. Not pride, not victory. Something gentler. Belonging. The boardroom wasn't silent this time. It was listening. The air wasn't stiff with judgment or saturated in ego. It was filled with breath, leaning forward, waiting, curious. Thomas stood at the end of the table, not as a janitor, not as a novelty, but as the soul of something new taking root. On the projection screen behind him, a contract clause glowed. Simple words, plain language. But the ripple of its meaning stretched far beyond ink and intention. This line here, he said, tapping gently on the screen, it doesn't just protect the company, it protects the person, the one answering phones in the satellite office, the one stocking supplies in the dead of night. He turned. Because a company can't truly be protected if its people are disposable. No one interrupted, not this time. Angela Rollins closed her binder slowly, arms resting on it like folded wings. She looked at him. Not above or below, but eye to eye. Are we ready to standardize this framework across departments? Langston leaned forward. Make it law at Langston Global. Heads nodded around the room. No resistance. Thomas didn't smile. Not yet, because it wasn't about applause anymore. It was about architecture, building something that would last long after his footsteps no longer echoed in these halls. That evening, he walked the floors like he used to. Not in silence, but in reflection. From the legal wing, to the accounting corridor, to the break room that used to smell like over-toasted bagels and ammonia wipes. And at every turn, people stopped him. Not to marvel, to thank, to ask questions, to offer ideas, to contribute. Something was awakening here. Not just in policy, in people. When he reached the basement, yes, he still went there, he found a note taped to the old locker that once held his cleaning gloves. Thank you, Mr. Greene. Because of you, I asked for a promotion, and I got it. Darla, night shift. It was written in purple ink, the handwriting uncertain. But the message? Certain as a sunrise. He left it there. Some stories shouldn't be erased. Back upstairs, Langston met him outside the executive elevator. He didn't speak right away, just handed Thomas a leather portfolio. Inside was a plan. A radical one. Langston Global would partner with community colleges in 4 boroughs to offer scholarships, not just for business students, but for janitors, cashiers, nursing aides, maintenance techs. The quiet hands, the night workers, the ones no one ever expected to lead. Thomas blinked. You want me to oversee this? I want you to design it, Langston said. From the ground up, as big as you dare. Thomas traced the page edges with his fingertips. You're sure? Langston looked at him, solemn and steady. You saw us when we didn't know we were asleep. Now help us wake up everyone else. For the first time since Clara's letter, Thomas felt his throat tighten. But he nodded. He didn't need more time. That weekend, he sat in his modest apartment. Bookshelves stacked high with everything from contract law to philosophy to poetry, and began drawing up the program. It was more than a partnership. It was a pipeline. From mop to meeting room, from overlook to advisor. And it wasn't built on quotas. It was built on conviction. On Monday morning, Langston stood beside him as they announced it to the press. The cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, but Thomas didn't look at them. He looked at the back of the room where Darla stood, where Reuben had shown up in his old coveralls, arms crossed with pride, where Ezra, the intern, held up his notebook like a torch. When Thomas spoke, his voice didn't aim to impress. It aimed to remind. Some of the most brilliant minds I've ever met were covered in sweat, not accolades. He paused, and all they needed was a door. He stepped back. Langston whispered beside him, You didn't just open it, Thomas. You tore the damn wall down. That evening, the company's internal servers crashed. Too many employees had logged in at once to enroll in the first round of evening classes, mentorship matches, and leadership pathways. The IT director chuckled. We've never had this kind of traffic, ever. Thomas just nodded. Change wasn't polite, it was hungry. The final moment of the night was quiet. No flashbulbs, no emails. Just Thomas alone in his office, coat on the chair, tie loosened, staring at a framed photo on his desk. Clara, sunlight in her hair, laughter mid-breath. He whispered, "You were right." She'd told him long ago, don't wait to be asked into the room, build one. Now that room had glass walls, and a door wide enough for everyone. The ceremony wasn't planned. Not by PR teams, not by executives, not for headlines. It began with a single email. Subject, honoring the quiet architects. No graphics, no RSVP, just a line of text at the bottom. We are gathering at 5 p.m. in the atrium. Bring nothing but your story. And they came. By the dozens, then hundreds. Suits beside uniforms, interns beside founders. The air filled not with spectacle, but with reverence. A kind of reverence not for fame or wealth or performance, but for presence. Langston stood at the center, beside the piano in the corner. No one had ever noticed before. Now it gleamed under soft lights, its black lacquer reflecting more than just the ceiling. He cleared his throat. No microphone needed. We spend our lives chasing titles, he began, but some of the most powerful people I've ever met carry none. He looked out over the crowd, then turned to the right, and gestured. Thomas Greene stepped forward. No spotlight chased him, no orchestra rose, just a man in a plain blazer walking like he always had, quietly, with purpose. He took his place beside Langston, then turned toward the gathering. His eyes paused as they passed faces he knew and some he didn't, but recognized anyway. People who were once passed over, now present. Thomas spoke. I used to believe that the ceiling above me was made of glass. He paused, his voice strong but measured. But it wasn't. It was made of assumption. A ripple ran through the crowd. I didn't break it alone. I spoke truth quietly until the world got loud enough to listen. He held up the original contract, the one that changed everything. Framed now. A single red corrected clause circled in his handwriting. This clause didn't save a company. It reminded it who it serves. He turned, handed the frame to Langston, and nodded. I don't need a statue or a corner office. I don't even need this plaque. What I need is this. He motioned to the crowd. People who feel seen. A long silence, then applause, soft at first, then rising, then thunderous. And still, Thomas didn't smile for the cameras. He smiled at the janitor in the back of the room holding a dustpan, at the cafeteria worker dabbing tears from her apron, at Marissa Cheng, standing tall now, directing the mentorship program he'd helped her design, and at Ezra, who now sat at a desk where he once whispered questions. Legacy, Thomas knew, wasn't built in public. It was carried in private. After the crowd dispersed, after the lights dimmed, after Langston walked him to the curb like an old friend, Thomas stood alone outside the building. The night air was crisp, the city glowing like a low-burning lantern. Then a cab pulled up. The window rolled down. Inside sat a boy, no more than 12, with a clipboard, a mother beside him holding her phone. "Excuse me, are you Mr. Greene?" the boy asked. Thomas bent slightly. "I am. I'm writing a school paper about people who changed companies without being the boss." Thomas chuckled. "That's a good topic," the boy nodded seriously. "My mom told me what you did. She said you made the rules fairer." He paused. "I want to do that one day." Thomas knelt beside the window. "Then start by asking questions others are afraid to." The boy nodded, solemn. The cab pulled away, and Thomas stood on the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, heart full in a way that no award, no title, no balance sheet could ever explain. He turned back once, looking up at the glass tower where he'd once mopped alone. Now it shimmered with meaning, because within those walls, the world had learned something profound. That power isn't always loud. Sometimes it whispers. And when it whispers truth long enough, the whole world leans in to listen. Sometimes the most brilliant minds walk among us quietly, carrying mops instead of briefcases, wearing name tags instead of titles. Thomas Greene didn't storm into boardrooms demanding respect. He earned it. One unseen act at a time. This isn't just a story about a janitor who fixed a contract. It's about dignity in the shadows. It's about the unseen strength of those who read between the lines when no one's watching. It's about never letting your title define your truth, and knowing that wisdom isn't earned through wealth, but through quiet perseverance. In a world addicted to status, Thomas reminded us that legacy is built in whispers, not applause. That real change starts when someone dares to see value in the overlooked and has the courage to listen. So, wherever you are, whether you're holding a mop, a pen, or a dream no one else understands, know this: you matter, you belong, and the world is waiting to be rewritten by you.